So without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce my colleague, Sean Thompson from Mandiant, and he is going to chat today about next generation insider risk management. Sean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Well, good morning. It's very nice to be here. I'm honored to have been asked and selected to present. I had a breakfast with a gentleman this morning, and he had a speech talk yesterday, and he was lamenting how there were two lawyers before him who only filled up one row, but he filled up the entire room, so made me a little self-conscious. So I'm glad to see so many of you here in the room today. So again, very excited to be talking about a topic today, which is probably a little bit different than what you're seeing here at MWise. But in my opinion, it is the biggest threat to any company, are insiders, and we'll certainly talk about that. But again, my name's Sean Thompson. I'm the senior manager at Mandiant for Global Insider Risk. One caveat, the views expressed and opinions expressed are my own, not necessarily that of Mandiant or Google. My background includes over 20 years in insider risk management as a CEO, Assistant United States Attorney, Assistant General Counsel, Senior Manager, Investigator, and Analyst. I have been fortunate to have worked for a number of agencies, including FBI, DNI, DoD, as well as NSA. And in that capacity, was fortunate to see a broad range of insider risk management cases. So worked a lot from the initial investigation through prosecution, and have interesting, unique perspective that I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. My first exposure to insider risk was actually my first case as an AUSA. Started off as a simple fraud case. Individual working for a large apparel manufacturer was defrauding the company, setting up his own company, dummy invoices, and capturing the profit that way. It quickly turned into an economic espionage case involving co-conspirators and competitors trying to steal the company's sophisticated shoe design technology. So that case taught me a lot. Through the investigation, we uncovered the usual indicators, several emails, kind of surprising, but with the competitors, downloads, thousands of pages of documents, all the usual indicators. What that case taught me was the vulnerability of companies that insiders can cause, the impact that they cause, as well as the fact that there are controls that can be in place, and this was 20 years ago, but there still were things that should have been done that were not put in place. And through my years with FBI and DOJ, I was fortunate to be the lead espionage attorney, so saw all the cases, triaged all the federal cases, private cases, and through that continued to see the impact that insiders have. And it just continued to build, and I decided to finally leave and try to apply my experience in the private sector, and went and started my own firm where I presented ability to assess, design, and build programs for private industry. And through that experience, really learned that insider threat is something that is taken seriously by boards, by companies, and that there are processes and procedures in place that can be effective. So fast forward to today, I feel we're at an inflection point in insider risk management for several reasons. Number one, there are many more companies that are starting programs. According to Gartner, only about 10% of large companies have insider risk programs. They expect that to rise to 50% by 2025. The market itself, services, tools, estimated around $3.5 billion, is expected to be $14 billion by 2030. And the lines between insider and outsider continue to blur which makes our job even more difficult. So my objective here today is to leave you with three things. Help you to understand the current state of insider threat, identify some current trends, patterns, and discuss some solutions to actually solve these problems. Quick on some foundational context. Insider threat is a growing problem. According to Ponemon latest research, $18 to $20 million per insider incident. The rate of insider threats is increasing, continues to increase and impact organizations at an unprecedented rate. Depending on the stats that you review, insiders make up 80 to 90% of all incidents. According to Verizon, at least 75 to 80% of incidents involve human activity. So insider threats are obviously something that needs to be part of any security, compliance, and regulatory program. A couple of things, insider threat often gets diluted by everyone thinking that all insiders are threats. Of course, that's not the case. Not every insider is a threat. Every insider is potentially a risk, but what we need to do is apply a risk management approach to be able to properly allocate resources. And when we apply that risk management approach, it allows us to bring in the concept of assets, vulnerabilities, to understand impacts, where we can focus efforts and identify those personas and events to be able to build out controls, solutions, et cetera. All right, so reviewing a next-gen insider threat, I think is helpful to look at three main areas: the changing mindset, changing opportunities, and changing circumstance. So the changing mindset, what I'm talking about is the motivation and opportunities, the motivation and intent that an insider has. You know, motivations being the why they take action, and the intentions, the outcome that they're looking to achieve. You know, Robert Hansen was the traditional insider threat. He was motivated primarily by narcissism, and his intention was to sell information for profit, but really to feed his narcissistic tendencies. His was to deliver information to support his Russian handlers. Robert Hansen, in this case, I was fortunate to be at the FBI and to met many agents who worked on the case and some that befriended him. And that case really taught me there's a human side to insider threat. You know, one agent that I knew in particular was actually scheduled to have lunch with Hansen on the next day. He was arrested on Sunday. He was supposed to have lunch with him on Monday. Now, he wasn't involved in the investigation, of course, but he was really thrown off, to say the least, by the arrest, and it really struck him, and he thought that he should have seen some of these tendencies, or he should have seen it. So it taught me that, you know, it has an impact on colleagues, it has an impact on organizations, when we feel like we're supposed to be able to identify who insiders really are, but obviously it's not that simple. You know, Edward Snowden kind of transformed from that traditional to a new leaker mindset, if you will. Someone who's not motivated by narcissism or greed per se, but more ideology. Although, in my opinion, there was some self-aggrandizement with Snowden. He really was seeking that public attention, even though it was couched in this doing the public good concept. And really, you know, his intention, again, stated, was to help the country understand what was going on. Again, a different change from Hansen selling information to Snowden simply disclosing information. And now we have what I call insider threat, 3.0. The motivation is really pure greed, and the intention is simply to enable access, not necessarily sharing information or selling information, giving access. And this changing mindset has been fueled by what I call changing opportunities, or the ways and means that insiders have to execute their actions. It can be best understood in the context of solicitation and acceptance. Historically, the you think of the Deep Throat, Mark Felt, Washington Post, Watergate leaks. That was done very, covertly. It was not advertised. They were in the parking garages, but all done very covertly, very cloak and dagger-like. We then moved to WikiLeaks with the advent of WikiLeaks and similar websites devoted to leaking information. We then turned to more of an overt solicitation. Not only was it acceptable, but actually being out there in the public domain. And I remember precisely when it hit me that we had changed in that I just returned with my boss from briefing, General Alexander at NSA, on WikiLeaks. I get back to our office and someone shows me a 3-page spread from a national newspaper detailing very clearly how to leak information, how to get away with it, how to use secure drop, I thought I was reading a counterintelligence report, but there it was in the paper, out in the open. What it taught me was that was a watershed moment. We had changed. We had shifted from this being a covert model to clearly an overt model. Today, now we're dealing with targeted recruitment, advertising by insiders themselves, as we see up 300% in targeted recruitment and advertising. Generally, we're talking about dark web, we're talking about Telegram channels, lapses, et cetera. And I think this really drives home the point from Bruce Schneier there. That's, we're really attacking the people are still the weakest link. And these changing opportunities have been exacerbated in the context of what I call changing circumstances or work conditions. We continue to give people more access than they need to do their job. According to most research, 60% to 70% of employees have more access than they need. Other research supports that 25% of people have access to most or all of the company's data. And most strikingly, 90%, once they leave, have some access for a period of time once they leave the organization. So giving more people more access, more devices, more ways to access, more ingress, egress opportunities. And to make it worse, most organizations don't have the basic program or controls in place to properly mitigate this threat. So where does that leave us? So I think we've kind of opened Pandora's box now. We've got an insider who is likely and largely motivated by greed. They feel the bar is very low to execute their actions, very low risk, simply to pull down some information on probably a device that may or may not even be monitored, send information to a personal device, any number of egress methods, and then to upload to any number of the sites that we just discussed. But fear not, there are opportunities to intercede here, and we'll talk about some of them as we go. So what are some of the trends that I'm seeing and some of the needs that we need to be concerned about? The first, we need to focus on what's important. We need to focus on behaviors, and not just behaviors in the digital domain, but across all three, physical as well as personnel. Currently we're still primarily stuck in a log, metadata, policies-based methodology that is tough to really analyze behaviors. We're still stuck in actions triggering on certain policies. And that's difficult to do in one domain, and it's very difficult to do across all three, but we need to bring those three domains together, again, focusing on those relevant interactions by applying a risk management approach to identify those interactions that are most important, those that involve your critical assets, those that involve your crown jewels, and to do that by design. So designing through a program, designing those collaboration points, for example, with HR to, for example, let security know when employees are leaving, to let security know when there's an investigation. Those are clear indicators that something might be wrong, that something might need to at least be put on a watch list, maybe do some additional investigation. Now, focusing on behaviors needs to be done in a tailored construct. Now, as an attorney, I often have conversations between the security operators and the legal and privacy counsel when it comes to conducting any type of monitoring. And often the discussion is around privacy, quite naturally. But there are three things that can be done to really help facilitate. First, bring legal in early in any type of monitoring. If you're building a new tool, or you want to deploy a new tool, or you're developing a workflow, bring them in early to the discussion. Number two, make sure they understand the tool. Make sure they understand what is going on. No attorney is going to approve any action tool monitoring unless they understand completely. And three, full transparency. Make sure they understand the full capabilities of the tool. I've seen cases where the attorneys were not aware of keystroke monitoring in a tool, and they completely shut the program down and set program back several years. So full transparency, let them know all the capabilities, and you can usually get to where you need to be. And again, focusing on, as Kevin Mandia mentioned yesterday, focus most on what matters most. And of course, those would be crown jewels. But this has to be done in a tactical manner, the tactical program. You got to have a program to be able to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but to set the strategy, set the vision and the objectives. But you have to turn this and make this tactical. And we can only do this through having defined use cases, defined policies, defined procedures, and marrying the strategic with the operational. And the last trend that I see is really developing insider risk compliance. The increasing use of monitoring, the increasing creation of programs will require a insider risk compliance program, and there's no better way to demonstrate to your attorneys that you take privacy and the legal implications seriously is to create a compliance program. Defining those controls, defining those reporting mechanism structures to legal, to senior leadership that show them that your Watch the Watchers program, if you will, is dedicated to produce the level of transparency and accountability necessary. So next-gen solutions. So we've talked a lot about AI this week. You've heard a lot about it. It's clearly something that we're all hearing a lot about. I first became aware of AI before ChatGPT, working with the financial sector and some of the use cases. They're usually the tip of the spear in cyber, certainly in insider as well. And there's some great use cases. We'll talk a little bit about some of those in a bit that are leveraging AI to really maximize and produce some excellent results. Of course, unfortunately, the bad guys are also using AI. We've seen that through use of development of malware. We've also seen that through the development of deepfake technologies, most recently with the Retool hack. If you guys are familiar with that, it was started out as a simple SMS phishing attack where it was largely unsuccessful. Unfortunately, as we were told, one person clicked on it. Obviously, that's all it takes. That then turned into a targeted phishing tactic using deepfake voice to then obtain the MFA codes. Eventually, the attacker was able to attach their own devices to the Okta account and took it from there. So we're seeing the bad guys use it. But again, as Kevin mentioned yesterday, help is on the way. I think AI is being integrated into more technology, more solutions. I'm grateful to be working at Google and Mandiant, where we are seeing products being developed, and we're at the cutting edge of turning that technology into practical use, and certainly over the next 6 to 12 months, we'll see more of that. So in terms of insider risk, as you can see here, I think there's several ways that AI is going to help. Clearly, just the productivity aspects alone are obvious, but also turning insider risk into more of a proactive exercise versus a reactive exercise. I think we have some real potential with AI to be able to do that. Just the large volume of information that is collected that needs to be analyzed. Obviously, AI can do that much faster than any manual processing. Leveraging natural language processing to be able to identify trends and patterns, to identify those baselining characteristics that are needed so much to be able to properly conduct insider risk investigations, as well as essentially performing that initial level 1 triaging for analysts to be able to allow the analyst to focus more specifically on those cases that matter, on those incidents that matter, and ultimately leading to a more predictive model, although a full predictive model I think is a little utopian and not realistic. That said, there are always anomalous activities, breadcrumbs. Throughout my career, I've never seen a case that did not have some type of indicators, some breadcrumbs that were there. I believe AI can really mature that and identify those as we move forward, so we can have at least some aspect of predictability. Now, zero trust. Now, as we discussed, AI being right around the corner, if you will, or obtainable, I think zero trust is a little bit more aspirational, at the moment. One comment here, it seems a little oxymoronic, zero trust and insider risk. You don't mean to not have any trust in your insiders. Obviously, trust is important in that sense. Actually, anecdotally, in my experience, the most tips and leads come from, probably 60% come from colleagues, coworkers, managers. So you need to have the trust in your organization. Here, obviously, zero trust, the zero trust framework from an access standpoint. But again, I think it's more aspirational and borne out by, again, Gartner, who observes 60% of organizations have a zero trust initiative, although only 1% actually have any measurable zero trust implementation that is effective. And they only expect that to rise to 10% by 2026. So it's a little ways off in terms of zero trust. That said, as we're discussing next generation solutions, there's certainly some advantages and some aspects, capabilities that zero trust can provide for insider risk. As you see, identity hygiene, requiring a solid understanding of who's accessing your system, continuously verifying that, monitoring that, to be able to establish, again, that baseline of activity, to be able to support the intelligent revocation, so we can hopefully bring that 90% down who have access when they leave down to 0, if we're lucky, or at least close to it. All right. So next, communications monitoring. So a lot of people, when I talk about this, they clinch up a little bit and they don't like communications monitoring. We're talking about email, chat, Teams, collaboration channels, corporate devices, of course, not personal devices. Potentially, if you have an MDM solution and you consent, but we don't need to talk about that. But corporate devices and monitoring for, historically, this is done in the financial sector per any number of regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley, SEC regulations pertaining to capturing the financial transactions, discussions, et cetera. You probably have seen in the news some of the fines that have occurred and some of the large banks paying hundreds of millions of dollars, it's because they're conducting financial transactional work on unapproved devices, or they're talking about it on channels that they shouldn't be. So this really comes up in the financial sector, but I'm seeing a trend to use that type of technology that is now primarily for compliance to now be leveraged for insider threat cases. And there are some increasing benefits, as I see, leveraging AI, really get what I call kind of left of left. So really get to the early breadcrumb state, earlier than any manual process, lexicon-based policy threshold process could ever get. AI, with its capabilities, as we discussed, will be able to provide that level of detail. And again, be much more proactive. Everybody wants to be proactive. We all know we need to be proactive, but it's extremely tough, extremely difficult to do so. I think AI and certainly communications monitoring, because it's a channel that is historically not monitored. Insiders know this. Insiders are using Slack. They're using Teams. They're using the other collaboration channels to discuss things that we call indicators of compromise, talking about how they don't like their job, they're disgruntled, they're not getting paid enough, they're going to leave. These are all things as insider risk professionals that obviously trigger or should trigger. And these are the channels that they're using. So we definitely want to be focusing in this area. Again, as an attorney, I appreciate the legal equities there, and certainly there are, and you will certainly have to have those discussions with your legal and privacy team. However, again, from a practitioner standpoint, this is an area where we do want to try to push the envelope, try to have those discussions with your legal, with your privacy, and again, wrap it around a compliance program. We need to do this properly, need to have the proper controls in place. But there are some very intriguing stats, as you see here, almost 4 times more accurate using a AI-generated ability to monitor communications versus a lexicon-based model. To me, that's huge, and that's really shows and I've seen this work in these cases, as we see here, that ability to really review sentiment analysis, something that's we've been talking about it for 15 years. No one's ever been able to really do it well. I think we're finally there. We're finally able to use that for disgruntlement cases. I had a case where an individual was, talking about how they were not happy and that they felt that they could get paid more somewhere else. And throughout this communication with the other individual, he also mentioned that other companies were paying more. So traditionally, a policy-based lexicon model would not be able to capture that. In this case, it did capture that. It triggered, it sent to the team to put on a watch list. This individual eventually, he was working at a hedge fund. He eventually downloaded some Python code of their quant models to his personal device, but it was captured because he was on the watch list. So again, without the AI, we never would have caught that. Another use case with flight risk. Another individual was saying that they weren't happy with their current situation. The market was all over the place, and they felt that they could do better on their own. Again, very tough to put those keywords in and through a lexicon-based approach catch that. Again, that triggered being placed on a watch list. 4 weeks later, the individual downloaded the entire portfolios and performance evaluations of all of the traders, and they were hoping to obviously pilfer the company and start their own, which would have cost the hedge fund billions of dollars. And last but not least, financial stress indicators. A case involving an individual who was chatting with his buddy about how he had just come back from Vegas and lost his shirt, and that he's never going back again, and hopefully the credit card companies don't come knocking. Now, again, policy, it was tough to, you're not going to find that being able to do keywords, likely impossible. AI was able to at least capture that, send that again to a watch list, sent it to the fraud team. 3 weeks later, he was submitting fraudulent invoices for $10,000, so he was caught and he was fired. So some great use cases for AI, great use cases for comms monitoring. Obviously, it needs to be done in the proper context, in the proper manner. Digital trust management. Digital stamps, watermarks have been around a long time, many years, but they've lacked a lot of capabilities. They haven't been really persistent, they haven't been dynamic, and most importantly, they were easily removed for the most part. And generally, they were part of a application themselves that created the content, so it was easy to remove. Third-party solutions often didn't allow complete blocking. They weren't invisible, and they weren't dynamic in the sense to capture the true progeny of that documentation, of that user. New technologies are currently out there and new solutions to be able to provide that dynamic capability, to be able to provide that dynamic understanding of the progeny, of who accessed what and where, to really aid in those leak investigations and to allow for a more robust investigative process. And the last one, AI rephrasing, if any of you have worked in the intelligence community, working counterintelligence, or if you've worked for Elon Musk, who's very fond of canary traps, you're probably familiar with canary traps. If those of you who aren't familiar, it's basically you have 10 individuals who you believe might be leaking some information. You then provide each one of those individuals a distinct copy of that document or information. That could be a difference between a space after a period or a comma instead of a semicolon, or different type of rephrasing. And then when it gets leaked, you find out who leaked it. If any of you have been involved in that, traditionally it's a very time-consuming, difficult model to deploy. You've got to really be clear about making this separate documentation and to whom it was sent, et cetera. With AI rephrasing, you can do all that in a push of a button and at scale. You can do this through a number of different models, a number of different individuals, and really make a robust leak investigation process, combining it with the other digital stamps and watermarks that we discussed. And of course, any next-gen discussion can't go without talking about the landscape. And what we're seeing is consolidation. We're seeing, we've seen that with AV, firewall, and we're starting to see that also in the insider risk space. We've all probably used or familiar with the point solutions, user activity monitoring, the DLP solutions, very noisy, very heavy on the endpoint as a point solution, tough to, really more of that policy-based modeling. But what we're seeing is consolidation, and what we need to get to is much more of a consolidated platform that takes the best of each of those solutions, the UAM, the comms, combining that with the relevant interactions from DLP, combining that with some analytics, with that AI analytics that we talked about, to really provide best of breed. And of course, that forensic capability, which sometimes gets lost, but to be able to have that immutable logs to be able to conduct and support that investigation and eventually the prosecution as well. And to make this work, what we really need to do is to make the program operational. Right? We can't just focus on the forest, we can't just focus on the trees. That doesn't work. We've got to bring the two together. I had a client who didn't have a program, and they were solely focused on deploying a tool. They had spent $15 million over 15 months, and they were trying to walk the cat backwards, if you will. They were trying to start with some specific use cases, but they didn't have the construct, they didn't have the program, they didn't have the strategy, the workflow, the authorization to operate from legal. They had none of the infrastructure in place to make it work, so that $15 million was essentially wasted money. So have to have both the forest, the program, have to have that foundation in place, combining that with that tactical to be able to enable those tool sets, to build out those use cases. And that's the only way true maturity can happen, is marrying those two together. Another, the last kind of next-gen solution that I see is really borrowing from what we've seen in cyber risk management, cyber risk performance management. Different than just risk management, different than just conducting assessments, but really using that and driving the maturity through conducting dynamic assessments, truly understanding what you're doing in your program, understanding where you need to go to improve your program, but doing that in, again, a dynamic, continuous fashion. And simply, as you see here, we need to standardize that strategy, those capabilities, document those so everyone knows what the playing field is, what those KPIs are, and then, of course, evaluate, and most importantly, improve. Okay, now bringing it all together. So how do we take this new insider threat 3.0? We've got some new trends, some new technologies. There's a lot of potential legal, privacy, equity issues. How do we bring that all together? How do we make a true program go from strategic and to align that with the tactical? And this is something I borrowed from the great John Wooden. If you guys are familiar with his pyramid of success, I thought this was a good way to portray kind of what that looks like in terms from an insider risk standpoint. It starts with that functional components, right? Identifying that ecosystem, that functional components of your program. Go into companies, and most companies of any size have the required functions there, and they're executing on them already, whether that's monitoring, analysis, investigation, training, risk assessment. The pieces are there. It's just not identified, and it's not viewed in a insider risk management concept. So first step, got to identify what those are, cross-function, bring those cross-functional teams together. Second, build that strategy and the governance. Build the vision, define those objectives, define the framework. What does your program, what's it going to look like? What does your board want it to look like, your SLT? What do they want it to look like? Not everyone's program is the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but identifying and capturing those goals and objectives, which will then allow you to build a tactical roadmap to understand, okay, here's where we want to go, defining those use cases, building out those KRIs, those key risk indicators, those key capabilities needed, and to execute on a truly tactical roadmap. And of course, layering on tools and technologies. But again, you can't start at level 4 at the top of the pyramid without building that foundation. It doesn't work. It's going to cost you money, it's going to cost you time, and it's going to be something that is not going to be successful. And last but not least, of course, we need to continuously improve, analyzing, responding to insider threats, building those workflows, building those processes, and building that iterative model. And lastly, just trying to provide a way to kind of visualize some of the things that we've discussed, kind of looking at the employee life cycle. Really the takeaway here is obviously front loading, right? A lot of this should already be in place. We get a lot of companies also when we do investigations that don't have a lot of the proper visibility, so it's tough to really help them. I mean, it's one thing to look at logs and look at EDR, but if you don't have the true visibility on the human error actions that we talked about, it's tough to really go back and do a fruitful post-investigation. So having those things in place, once you give the individual access to have risk management solution deployed, start baselining to be able to do some enhanced monitoring. Once you've identified your user groups, you understand how it aligns with your crown jewels, and then you can build out the additional policies as well. And obviously continues to enhance your investigations through focused monitoring, tactical analysis, and then obviously through removal. So key takeaways, we need to adapt to the new insider threat. Again, they're motivated by greed. They may not even need access to your crown jewels. We've seen where insiders are now simply agreeing to upload exploits to allow the outsider attacker to get access. So they may not even have access, but we got to start thinking about building those controls to defend against that type of threat. The threat who views the bar as pretty low when it comes to risk, as we discussed. Very anonymous. They can convey this information very anonymously with low risk to them. So we need to build the controls necessary to adapt. Second point there, again, little tongue-in-cheek, Big Brother. No one likes Big Brother. Don't use that term. But, right, be compliant, right? So talk to legal. When you're trying to push the envelope, when we're trying to do true insider risk management is going to require some level of monitoring beyond the traditional endpoints, SIM logs. You're going to have to get into more of the specific user activity monitoring controls. You're going to have to explore those solutions, some of the comms monitoring. So we're going to have to get there. So, but again, be compliant. Build out the processes to have that Watch the Watchers program, to be able to keep the program running, to be able to provide that transparency and that accountability. And last but not least, don't forget about the program in your program. I've seen so many companies who want us to come in and assess and help them with their program, and they feel that they have a program and they just want us to, that they have no program. They've got this separate stovepiped areas. They've got their monitoring group who handles their tools. They've got several investigation groups, one for HR, one for fraud, one for security, one for fit. So they have different groups, but they don't have a true program, which requires bringing together, as we've discussed, some of those cross-functional components across HR, across legal, across the business units, across security, CISO, CSO, the CRO, all of these components need to be brought to the table and be unified around a strategic, collaborative mission for this to work. So again, as you move forward, don't forget about the program as we continue to operationalize and make this a more tactical and effective solution. With that, I believe we have 1 minute left according to my clock. If anyone has questions, or I'll certainly stay after to discuss as well. Yes?
Just wonder if you can guide on any references in regard to metrics and measurements for the programs that you discussed. Like even you mentioned zero trust deployments, implementations. Like, is there any metrics of performance of that implementation actually that you've seen, or any measurements that could be recommended?
For insider risk management, obviously,
Yes.
from a program
Yes.
perspective.
Yes.
Yes, so, as you know, there is no NIST, ISO, insider risk framework. So, we've built a bespoke framework ourselves, but we've leveraged the pieces from NIST, because there are pieces in NIST, pieces in ISO 27000. Carnegie Mellon Institute has some good pieces. So we've taken the best of that, combined it with our own experience, and what we've done is built a model based on 10 components, 10 functional components, supported by key capability factors, and that's what we use to assess the overall strategic program. So everything from governance and strategy, training, awareness, investigation, monitoring, analysis, risk assessment, and oversight and compliance. Look at that program, look at your ecosystem, your functions from that standpoint, provide you an understanding of where you're at from a capability perspective. That kind of lays the foundation. You can then identify those gaps and build out processes.
Great answer, Sean. Thank you. If anyone had one burning question. All right, then we'll wrap up. Let's give
All right,
Sean a
thank
big
you.
round of applause.